Chapter 20 of Under Caesar by Baroness Orczy. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please go to LibriVox.org. Chapter 20. His blood shall be on our head, if any hand be upon him. Joshua 2:19. The heat was intense. The glare from the tribunes opposite seemed to sear the eyes, and from below there rose to the nostrils that awful, sickening stench of human blood. The public, frantic with excitement, was clapping and cheering. Thousands of necks were craned to get a better view into the floor of the arena. Thousands of fans were fluttering, children were laughing, and women chattered incessantly like a pack of monkeys. And down below the baffled panther sent roar upon roar of rage into the seething cauldron of 1,000 sounds. The creature had been cheated to the last. A score of victims had been pushed into his lair to tempt him. He had stalked them in play at first, then more earnestly, finally with a mad desire for blood, but always his prey escaped him. Invisible hands showed the means of escape. The crimson ladders seemed to multiply their numbers until all around the walls they showed innumerable paths to safety. The panther seemed to know that those streaks of crimson were his mute enemies. He made several ineffectual dashes for them, but always his claws slid against the marble, and he fell back into the sand snarling with rage. Once or twice his prey was more attainable. He caught a foot, a leg, a hand. Thrice he brought a huge panting body to the ground, but even then he was cheated of his victory. Long iron grapnels, wielded by unseen hands, dragged the mangled limbs and torn bodies roughly from his clutch, leaving behind them trails of torn flesh and streams of blood, which only helped to exasperate the beast by their insufficiency. And now the panther was like a black, snake-like fury, blind with rage and unsatisfied lust, with tail lashing like a whipcord and yellow eyes that gleamed like tiny suns. His jaws were red and dripping. His claws had been torn by the same grapnels that had snatched his prey from him. He had ceased to roar, but snarl upon snarl escaped his panting throat. The public delighted in him. They loved to see the ferocious brute maddened by these tortures, beside which the agony of Tantalus was but the misery of a child. Then Caligula rose to his feet, and his heralds blew loud blasts upon their trumpets. In a moment silence fell on the entire arena. The pandemonium of shouts and laughter and shrieks of agony was hushed as if by the magic of an almighty power. The Emperor was standing and desired speech, and all at once silence descended upon this vast concourse of people. Everyone rose, since the Cæsar was standing. All heads were turned towards the tribune, all eyes fixed upon the misshapen figure with its halo of gold round the grotesque head and the metal thunderbolts held aloft in the hand. The only sound that was not stilled at the Cæsar's bidding was, down below, the snarl of the angry panther. "Citizens of Rome," began Caligula, as soon as he could make himself heard. "Patricians of Rome, soldiers, senators, all my people, I, even I, your Cæsar, your Emperor, your God, do give you greeting. I have sought to please you and to make you happy on this my first day amongst you all." Here he was interrupted by vociferous cheering. Next to shows and spectacles, to games and theatres, there was nothing that the people of Rome loved better than to hear impassioned speeches thundered at them either from the rostra in the forum or from any convenient spot whence the voice of a good speaker would rouse a sense of excitement or elation in their hearts. Demagogues and agitators, rhetoricians and poets were all sure of a hearing if only they were sufficiently inspired and sufficiently eloquent. But it was not often that the Cæsar himself would pour forth imperial oratory into the delighted ears of his people, and a fervent speech from the Emperor at this moment, when excitement and exhilaration were at fever pitch, was a pleasure which no one had foreseen, but which filled everyone with delight. "Glad I am," continued Caligula, when the excitement had calmed down momentarily, "that my efforts to please you have met with success." They have," yelled the enthusiastic crowd. "The gods have indeed rewarded me, not beyond my deserts, for that were impossible, but in a just measure, by giving me the love of my people." Hail Caesar! Hail the greatest and best of Caesars! Came in deafening echoes from every side of the immense amphitheatre. I thank you all. Your loyalty today has greatly cheered me. I, as your supreme Lord and God, will shower my blessings upon you. As a god, I am immortal. Always I will watch over you, sitting at the right hand of Jupiter Victor, my father, from all times. But in my earthly shape, I may not be with you always. There may come a time when godlike duties call me to Olympus. Then must a wise and just ruler take my place at the head of this great empire. No, no, hail to thee, Caesar, immortal Caesar, cried the people, and Caligula, stricken with vanity, as if with plague, was deaf to the ironical cheers that accompanied these cries. Immortal am I, he said, whilst his bloodshot eyes travelled restlessly over the sea of faces spread out before him. Immortal, yet destined to leave you one day, and when that day comes there will be weeping in the city and moanings throughout the empire, but the wise and just ruler who will follow in my wake will, while not able to console you for my loss, continue the good works which I have commenced. Citizens of Rome, patricians, soldiers, all listen to what I say. His face now looked purple with excitement, his hoarse voice shook as it escaped his throat, and his hair, thin and lanky, seemed to stand upon end all round his large bulging forehead. A gentle breeze had caught the folds of his purple tunic, and it fluttered all round him with a curious swishing noise, like the sighing of creatures in pain. The hand that held Jove's thunderbolt trembled visibly, and the perspiration was streaming down his face. There was not a man or woman present there at this moment who did not look upon him as an abject and hideous monster. There was no one there who did not loathe and despise him, and yet every one listened, and not one voice was raised in derision at his senseless oratory. Only the panther snarled, and its tail beat against the ground with a dull, monotonous sound, and Dea Flavia, standing beside the monster, white as the lilies which now lay withered at her feet, listened to every word that he said, whilst Taurus Antinor gazed on her and saw again in her eyes that look of anticipation and of understanding, as of one who knows what is to come. "Citizens of Rome," resumed the imperial mountebank after an impressive pause, "I have spent days and nights in communion with the gods, thinking of your welfare when I no longer will be amongst you all. And this is what I and the gods have decided. Listen to me, for the gods speak to you through my mouth. I, even I, your Caesar and your God, do speak. There dwells amongst us all one whose divinity is almost equal to mine own, one who by her beauty and her grace hath found favour with the gods and with me. She is of the house of Caesar, and hath name Dea Flavia, and I, the Caesar, have called her Augusta, and set her up above all other women in Rome. She comes from the house of the great Augustus himself, and it is a descendant of the great Augustus who alone will be worthy to wield the sceptre of Caesar when it hath fallen from my grasp. Therefore this have I decided. The son of Dea Flavia shall in time to come follow in my footsteps, and make you happy and prosperous, even as I have done. And because of this my decision, must I give Dea Flavia as wife unto a man who is worthy of her. Many there are who have aspired to her hand, but all of them I have hitherto rejected, because not one of them had given proof of his courage or of his strength. Citizens of Rome, patricians and soldiers all, what we must look for in your future ruler is valour in the face of death, coolness and intrepidity in the sight of danger. These qualities, which grace your present Caesar, must be transmitted to his successor through Dea Flavia the divine, and by a father who has given signal proof of his virtues. I have enjoined the Augusta Dea Flavia to bestow her hand on him who above all is worthy to be her lord. To this has she consented, and today she will make her choice. And herewith do I call on you patricians who aspire to her hand to enter the lists in her honour. Give a proof of your valour, of your intrepidity, of your courage. Show that you are as valiant as the lion, as wary as the snake. Descend into the arena now, unarmed, save for the hands which the gods have given you, and thus engage that unconquered monster in single combat. An even chance of life is given you, and I, even I, your Caesar, will give unto the victor the hand of the Augusta Dea Flavia in marriage." Even before his last words had echoed along the marble halls, deafening cries and cheers rent the air. Men shouted, women screamed and waved their fans, mantles were torn from every shoulder and swung overhead like flags. "Hail to Caesar! Hail to the best and greatest of Caesars! Hail to the Augusta Dea Flavia! Hail!" The shouts were incessant. Even whilst Caligula, delighted with this oratory, exultant over the success of his plan, stood there trembling in every limb, with moist, purple face turned from right to left to receive the acclamations of his people. His tiny eyes blinked with the glare that struck fully at them from opposite. His throat was parched with screaming, his tongue seemed to cleave to the roof of his mouth. Excitement was overmastering him, the effort to appear outwardly sane and calm was too severe a tax upon his raging temper. The heat, too, no doubt turned him giddy, for suddenly, even whilst the cries of "Hail!" buzzed in his ears, he threw up his arms and tottered backwards, rigid as a log, whilst drops of foam gathered at the corners of his mouth. It was Taurus Antinor who received the swooning Caesar in his strong arms. Everyone else around was too excited to move. The Augustas, inwardly consumed with jealousy, were striving to keep up an appearance of dignity in the face of the insult which they deemed had been put upon them by this semi-deification of their kinswoman. Dea Flavia, pale and silent, stood facing the people, with eyes that seemed to look upon something unearthly far away. Her white robes, shimmering with precious stones, fell round her like a shroud. Her lips were parted, as with a cry that had died even before it had found birth in her throat. The public thought that she looked proud, and acclaimed her because of this strange aloofness which seemed to envelop her whole person. She did not look of this world at all. Even the eyes appeared sightless and dead. When the Cæsar fell back, half fainting, she seemed to wake from her dream. A shudder went right through her as her eyes slowly turned from their vacant gaze to the prostrate figure of this inhuman monster lying stricken like a felled brute in the arms of the praefect of Rome. Once again, and for the third time today, her eyes met those of Taurus Antinor, but this time it seemed to him that within their still mysterious depths he read something akin to an appeal. As on that day in the Forum, intense pity, which had given birth to love, filled his heart for this beautiful young girl who seemed so lonely in the midst of all this pomp. The purity of her soul appeared to him undimmed, even though he knew now that she had expected this awful thing all along, and that she was no stranger to this monstrous barter of her person for the attainment of a crazy emperor's whim, or to make holiday for the rabble of Rome. In his sight her pride remained unshaken. Only her loyalty and allegiance had been given to the Cæsar in the same way as his own had been. She, in her simple womanly way, was rendering unto Cæsar that which was Cæsar's, and Taurus Antinor, whilst tenderly pitying her, felt that he had never loved her as fondly as he did now. The curse of the dying freedwoman was indeed bearing fruit. Dea's favours, her loyalty, were turning to bitter malediction for the recipients. More than one man today, mayhap, would die an horrible death in the hope of winning her grace, and Taurus Antinor, in the silent depths of his soul, prayed unto God that the woman he loved should never, as Menecreta had foretold, be driven to beg for mercy from a heart that knew it not, and find a pitiless ear turned to her prayers. Caligula had quickly shaken himself free from the arms that held him. The fainting fit which had threatened him passed away as swiftly as it had come. His lust of hate and revenge was so keen at this moment that it conquered all his physical weakness. When he realized that it was Taurus Antinor who was supporting him, he contrived to smile benignly and placidly upon him. "I am well," he reiterated cheerfully. "Did my voice carry all over the amphitheatre? Did everyone hear what I said?" "Everyone heard thy voice, O Cæsar," said Taurus Antinor slowly. "And see, the aspirant for the Augusta's hand has prepared to do battle for her sake." End of chapter 20. Chapter 21 of Unto Caesar by Baroness Orczy. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please go to LibriVox.org. Recording by Andrea. Chapter 21. But truly, as the Lord liveth, and as thy soul liveth, there is but a step between me and death. 1 Samuel 20 verse 3. When the Caesar had finished speaking, and he fell swooning back in the arms of the Prefect of Rome, the conspirators remained quite still, staring at one another, dumbfounded. Could any man at that moment have divined the secrets of the heart, and looked into the thoughts of all these men, what a medley of terror and of lust, of rage and of jealousy, would have been unfolded before his eyes. The plotters were like men who, falling to with axe and pick to demolish a building, had seen that same building collapse beneath their feet. They had sat quietly by all the day, watching the events, content that these would shape themselves in accordance with their will. Young Aeschines from time to time fingered the poniard which he had hidden under his tunic. Hortensius Martius gave free rein to his ardent admiration of Dea Flavia. Ancreus the elder kept watch over every phase of the temper of the audience, its apathy, its excitement, its murmurs of dissatisfaction and cries of enthusiasm. Only Caius Nepos, white to the lips, sat in terror lest the courage of the conspirators whom he had betrayed should fail them at the 11th hour, and he, branded as a false informer, be left to encounter the fury of an almighty Caesar who had never been known to relent. The speech of Caligula had, of a truth, struck strangely upon his hearers. The men who had been willing to wait upon chance for the success of their plot now found that chance had waited upon them. The thought of treachery did not at first enter their minds. The freaks of the crazy emperor were as numerous and as varied as the grains of sand in the arena. That he should offer the hand of his kinswoman as a prize to a victor in the arena was not inconsistent with his perpetual desire for new sensations, his lust of tyrannical power, and his open contempt for all his fellow men. His allusions to his probable successor had seemed futile and of no account, and they all felt that they had wallowed so deeply in the mire of conspiracy together that it could not have served the purpose of any one of them to betray the others. The first moment of stupefaction had quickly passed away, and even before the Caesar had recovered consciousness, Hortensius Martius had risen to his feet. There had been no hesitation in him from the first. Whilst the others pondered, vaguely frightened at this turn given by chance to her wheel, he was ready to stake his life for the possession of Dea Flavia and of the Imperium. His passion for the beautiful woman would have led him into far wilder extravagances and into far graver dangers than an encounter in a public arena with a wild beast, and the momentary degradation of offering his patrician person as a spectacle for the plebs. And because of this sudden decision, taken boldly whilst others wavered, he became tacitly the leader of the gang of plotters. When he jumped to his feet, ready to descend into the arena, he seemed to challenge them to keep their oath of allegiance to him. Who would succeed in winning Dea Flavia for wife? Hortensius Martius had proved himself to be a true opportunist, for he had seized his opportunity just at the right moment when the others hesitated. Thus are leaders made: one bold movement whilst others sit still, one step forward whilst the others wait. "Thy chance, O Hortensius Martius," whispered Marcus Ancreus the elder, close to the young man's ear. "Aeschines and the rest of us will be ready when the time comes, mayhap before thou dost return to us from below." Aeschines' hand beneath his tunic closed upon the dagger. Stronger and taller than Hortensius, he had not this sudden initiative of the brain. He was one of those men who would always be second to a bolder, a more resourceful leader. 40 pairs of eyes encouraged Hortensius Martius as he rose. In their minds they had already crowned him with laurels. For the moment they had accepted him as their future emperor and were prepared to acclaim him as Caesar when Aeschines had done his work. It was at this moment that Caligula recovered from his swoon. His lust of revenge and of hate brought him back to reality. He had planned to make the arch-traitor betray himself, and now, when he caught sight of Hortensius Martius preparing to descend into the arena, a cry as of some prowling savage beast rose and died in his throat. He was sufficiently cunning to control himself, sufficiently of an actor to play his part without betraying his thoughts. Though he would gladly have strangled Hortensius then and there with his own hands, he called the young man to him with kindly benevolence, and placed a fatherly hand upon his shoulder. "Thou, O Hortensius Martius!" he said in well feigned astonishment. "Even I, O Cæsar," replied Hortensius calmly. "For the love of the Augusta thou wouldst risk thy life." "To prove my valour, gracious lord, since thou didst desire it." "On thy knees then, O my son," rejoined the mountebank solemnly, "and receive the blessing of the gods." The public watched this little scene with palpitating interest. The Cæsar looked magnificent in his fantastic robes, and beside him Dea Flavia, like a goddess in her white tunic, was beautiful to behold. The Cæsar laid 3 fingers on the young man's head, and turned his bloodshot eyes up to the vault of heaven. Then Hortensius Martius rose from his knees and went up to the Augusta Dea Flavia, and knelt down before her. She took no heed of him whatever. She did not look upon his bowed head as he stooped very low and kissed the hem of her gown. Some who watched the scene very closely declared afterwards that she snatched her robe away from his hands. And from the arena down below was heard again the snarl of the thwarted beast. From the Emperor's tribune, to right and left, wide marble steps led down to the floor of the arena. At the bottom of these steps huge iron gates, wrought with gold and studded with nails, guarded them against access from below. 2 legionaries were stationed at these gates. When Hortensius Martius appeared at the top of the steps, the audience screamed with delight and cheered him to the echoes. He was indeed a figure like to please the most hardened spectator. Not over tall and slight of build, he looked elegant and graceful in his short white tunic, with the deep purple bands that proclaimed his patrician rank. A young exquisite, with well-groomed hands and hair delicately perfumed and curled. The tense expression of his face gave him nevertheless an air of determination and of strength. He had taken off his cloak and was winding it round his left arm. Otherwise, of course, he was unarmed as the Emperor had directed. The women blew him kisses across the width of the arena, and some of the more enthusiastic, or the younger ones, pelted him with roses as he came down the steps. And down below, the panther, as if scenting this new prey, sent a roar of expectation into the vibrating air. Caligula smiled with hideous complacency as he looked down on the descending figure of the young man, and when the people cheered, and the shower of roses fell in a blood-red mass at Hortensius's feet, the Cæsar snarled even as the panther had done, showing a row of yellow teeth like fangs. At last Hortensius Martius had reached the foot of the steps. The massive iron gates stood alone between him and the black panther, which cowered some 20 feet away behind a low monticule covered with tufts of grass, its tiny eyes of topaz fixed upon the oncoming prey. Hortensius gave the order for the opening of the gates. They swung upon the hinges, and he passed out through them, and they fell to behind him with a mighty clang. Thunderous applause greeted him when he set his foot upon the sands of the arena. The panther did not move. It had even ceased to snarl, but its sinewy tail beat a dull tattoo upon the ground. Then over the whole arena there rose a curious sound like the sighing of 200,000 souls, an indrawing of the breath in 200,000 throats. Hortensius Martius looked up, for the sigh had sounded very strangely in his ear, and it had been followed by a still stranger silence, as if 200,000 hearts had momentarily ceased to beat. And as he looked he understood the sigh, and also the death-like silence that followed. He saw that from the niches all round the arena the safety ladders of crimson silk had all been taken away, and up in the imperial tribune the mighty Cæsar laughed loudly and long. End of chapter 21.
Chapter 22 of Undo Caesar. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording done by Jules Harlock of Mississauga, Ontario, Canada. Unto Caesar by Baroness Orczy, Chapter 22. Greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends. St. John's 15, verse 13. No doubt that for the first tense moment all thought of treachery, of conspiracy, of the Imperium, and even Dea Flavia was absent from the young man's mind. It must have come upon him suddenly, then and there, that his life was now in almost hopeless jeopardy. He was unarmed, and all around him the smooth marble walls of the arena rose, polished and straight, to a height of at least 12 feet, to the row of niches which alone might afford him shelter. From the bases of the fluted columns, the iron rings to which the silken ladders had previously been attached, now hung at an unattainable height. The narrow ledge, 4 feet from the ground, had ceased to be a stepping stone to safety. All this, of course, came to him in a flash, as does to a dying man, they say. The varied pictures of his life, Hortensius Martius, in that one flash realized that he was a doomed man, that he had been trapped into this death trap, and that nothing now but a miracle stood between him and a hideous death. Men up above in the tribunes held their breath. Some women began to whimper with excitement. But the man and the panther stood for a moment eye to eye. No longer the hunted and the hunter, but the hungry beast of the desert and his certain prey. The baffled creature, tantalized with the blood of his other victims, was ready to satiate its lust at last. There was a moment of absolute silence, while two tiny golden eyes measured the distance for a leap. The young man now, with the cunning born of a mad instinct for life, was waiting with bent knees, body slightly leaning forward, and eyes fixed upon the brute. He had unwound the cloak from around his arm, and held it in front of him like a shield. The man and the beast watched one another thus for a few seconds, and to many those few seconds seemed like an eternity. Then, with a snarl, the panther bounded forward. The man held his ground for the space of 1 second, and as the brute landed within an arm's length of him, quick as lightning he threw his cloak right in its face. Then he began to run. The panther, entangled in the folds of the cloth, savaged and snarling, was tearing it to pieces. But Hortensius ran and ran, driven by the blind sense of self-preservation. He ran and ran the whole length of the arena, skirted the oval at the eastern end, and still continued to run, with elbows firmly held to his hips, and with swift winged steps that made no sound in the sand. But already the creature, realizing that again it was being cheated, started in pursuit. With leaps and bounds that seemed erratic and purposeless, it gradually diminished the distance between itself and the running man. Once it alighted on the outstanding branch of a gnarled tree, then from thence it took shelter in a clump of shrubs, then across the stream, swimming to the opposite shore, for the running man had rounded the oval and was now swiftly coming this way. Here in the tall grass it paused, cowering, once more on the watch, and Hortensius, while he ran so blindly along, had failed to notice where his enemy lay hiding. "In the grass!" shouted a dozen voices. "There! On ahead! Further on! No, no! Not there! Not there!" There was little exquisiteness left in the young man now. It was but a few moments since he had stepped smiling into the arena, kicking aside the rose leaves which enthusiastic hands had thrown in his path. It was but some minutes since he had begun to run, and now the perspiration was pouring from his body. His face was as grey as the sand of the arena. The fear of death had raised the death sweat on his brow. His breath came and went hot and panting through his nostrils. His eyes, dilated with terror, were vainly searching for the cowering enemy. Once more he turned to run. The panther seemed to be playing with him. A dozen times it could have reached him. A dozen times it bounded to one side, giving his prey another chance to run, another short respite for the agony of despair. Men, women, and children screamed with excitement. No longer did they cheer the handsome young patrician. No longer did they throw roses at his feet. They shouted to him to run because they knew that running was of no use. They urged the panther to leap because they fanned its rage with their screams. Habit, habit, they shouted with every bound of the ferocious creature. Habit, habit, now that Hortensius at last paused in his run. He stood quite still, for a veil had descended over his eyes. The whole arena began to spin and to dance before him. The marble columns were twisted awry. Thousands upon thousands of distorted faces grinned hideously upon him. Over the trees and the grass and the streams there was a film of red, the colour of blood, and through this film, which grew thicker and thicker as he gazed, he saw nothing, but just opposite to him, across the width of the arena, towering high above everything around, the tall figure of Dea Flavia, with her white dress falling straight from the shoulders, her fair hair crowned with diamonds, her face white as her gown, and her lips parted as if uttering a cry of horror. The next moment that cry, it was a woman's cry, did rend the air from end to end of the gigantic enclosure, and the cry was echoed and re-echoed by thousands and thousands of throats, as the panther, taking steady aim, leaped straight for the man. The noise became deafening. Men, women, and children, everyone screamed, and right through this whirling orgy of sound a voice was shouting, strong and mighty as that of Jupiter when he sends his decrees thundering forth into the air. By his throat, Hortensius, by his throat, and I'll at him whilst he pants. Hortensius put out his hands with the last instinctive sense of self-preservation. The mighty voice rang in his ear. It reverberated through the hot noonday air, and clanged against the copper gates as if a powerful arm had smitten them with the axe of Jove. The man saw the beast leap, felt the hot breath in his face, felt the two yellow eyes gleaming on him like burning suns, and his ears buzzed with a din of thousands of shrieks. Then he suddenly felt himself uplifted, whilst an agonized roar from the throat of a wounded beast overfilled the seething cauldron of sound. The prefect of Rome was standing in the arena now, and in his strong arms lifted high above his head he held the swooning man, while some few paces away the panther was lying prone, with blood streaming from its quivering jaws. It had all happened so suddenly that no one afterwards could say how it occurred. But there were those who retained a vision of the whole thing, and afterwards shared their impression with others. Everyone recollected when my lord Hortensius first entered the arena and the iron gates closed in behind him, that a general feeling of horror fell upon the entire public when it realized that all means of safety, all chance of escape, had been removed from those silken ladders, and that the young patrician had in truth been left at the mercy of a powerful brute, goaded to madness through the baffled desire for blood. At that same moment the prefect of Rome disappeared from the imperial tribune, and the terrible scene between the hunting beast and the hunted man had begun. Time for the man to run round the arena, time for the brute to stalk and play with its prey. Time, it seemed, for the prefect of Rome to make his way from the imperial tribune to the east end of the arena, where was stationed the city guard of which he had full control. A few precious seconds in making the soldiers understand what he wanted, a few more seconds to command them to obey, for they stood as a phalanx against the gate, thinking the prefect mad in desiring to enter the arena. A few more seconds and Taurus Antinor was at last in the arena, shouting to the hunted man to have at the brute with his hands. But Hortensius was weak from exhaustion brought on by a life of luxury and idleness, and by the excitement of the last 2 days. He put out 2 feeble hands, and the panther was already on the leap. And by that time Taurus Antinor was between him and the brute. With a blow of his hard fists, fashioned in the far-off northern lands, and with the strength that is given to the barbarians of that sea-washed shore, he had drawn blood from the creature's jaw and sent it rolling back on its haunches, momentarily dazed. Only momentarily, however, whilst 200,000 throats yelled in unison, "Habit! Habit! Habit!" A precious moment that, with the maddened beast, a swooning man and no arms save a pair of fists, hard as iron, made with a hand slender and supple like the finest tempered steel. And while the panther fell back roaring, and before it could prepare for a new spring, Taurus Antinor had seized the swooning man. It was his turn to run now, for he had but a few seconds in which to save the life of his bitterest foe. Straight to the walls of the arena did he run, and his voice was heard speaking loudly and commandingly. "The arcade, man! Rouse thyself! The arcade! The rings in the columns! Quick!" It needed the strength of a bullock's to accomplish the deed, that, or the strength which comes from unbendable human will. The man, only half conscious, returned to his senses by the force of that same will. The instinct of life was strongest in the end, and when Taurus Antinor leaped upon the ledge and hoisted Hortensius's body high above his head, the young man, with the final effort born of hope and built upon despair, reached up and caught one of the massive rings embedded in the bases of the fluted columns. For a few seconds he remained suspended, his body swinging against the marble wall, whilst the public cheered with an enthusiasm that knew no bounds. From below the prefect helped to push the feeble body up. Then another jerk, a pull upwards, a push, and Hortensius Martius had found safety in one of the niches of the arcade. "Hail to the prefect of Rome! Hail!" came in a continuous, thunderous roar from every corner of the arena, even as with a sudden bound the Black Panther had sprung up upon Taurus Antinor, and catching him unawares had felled him to the ground. End of chapter 22. Chapter 23 of Unto Caesar. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording done by Jules Harlock of Mississauga, Ontario, Canada. Unto Caesar by Baroness Orczy, Chapter 23. Well done, thou good and faithful servant. St. Matthew's 25, verse 21. A tumult amongst the people. Aye, it was here now, fully aroused. The prefect of Rome was popular with the plebs. His action in the arena had called forth unbounded enthusiasm. when he fell rolling into the sand with the Black Panther snarling above him, his steel-like grip warding for the moment the brute's jaws from off his throat. The people broke out in a regular frenzy. "The Prefect! The Prefect!" they shouted. Men climbed down along the gradients, leaping over other men, determined to jump down 12 feet into the arena in order to rescue the Prefect from the jaws of the ferocious beast. But above in the imperial tribune, the Caesar sat snarling like the panther and rubbing his hands with glee. His trap had been over-successful. One by one the arch-traitors fell headlong into it. First Hortensius Martius, the young fool. What mattered if he had escaped from a ravenous panther? The claws of the vengeful Caesar were sharper far than those of any beast of the desert. And now Taurus Antinor, the Prefect of Rome, the man of silence and of integrity, the idol of the people, the scorner of Caesar's godhead. Vague rumours had reached Caligula of the Prefect's strange sayings, his refusal to enter the temples and to sacrifice to the gods. People said that the Anglicanus worshipped one who claimed to be greater than Caesar and all the deities of Rome. Well, so be it. There he lay now in the dusk, a huddled mass of man and beast, the sand of the arena reddened with his blood. Caligula screamed like the rest of his people, but his cry was, "Habet! Habet!" And in the frenzy of rage and hate his thumb pointed downwards, downwards, as if it were a dagger which he could plunge into the Anglicanus' throat. But the city guard were the first to break their bounds. Even whilst the imperial madman exulted and shrieked forth his murderous "Habet!" they had rushed to the rescue of their Prefect. The powerful grasp on the panther's throat was on the point of relaxing. The brute was digging its claws into the shoulders of the fallen man, and he, feeling faint with the loss of blood, looked upon death as it stared down at him from the beast's golden eyes, and all that he was conscious of was the feeling that death was good. When the city guard rushed to his rescue, and by dint of numbers and strength of steel, tore the ferocious creature from the body of its prey, Taurus Antinor lay a while half conscious. He heard the cry of the people round him. He felt a shower of sweet scented petals fall upon him from above. He heard the last dying roar of the panther, and a scream of rage from the imperial tribune. Then the din became deafening. The trampling of feet, the rushing hither and thither, the cries, the imprecations, and from beneath the tribunes in their distant prisons, the roar of caged beasts like the far-off rumbling of thunder. Taurus Antinor raised himself on his knees. Both his shoulders had been lacerated by the panther. He was bleeding from several wounds about the legs and arms, and his whole body felt bruised and stiff. But he struggled to his feet, and now, leaning against a large tree trunk which had formed part of the setting of the scene, he tried to take in every detail of what was going on around him. There was, of course, a great deal of shouting and a general stampede in the tribunes of the plebs. In the midst of this shouting, which buzzed incessantly like the war of a great cataract, two cries resounded very distinctly above all the others. Thousands of people were shouting, "Hail to the Prefect! Hail to the God of valour and of strength! Hail, Taurus Antinor! Hail!" Whilst others cried more dully, yet equally distinctly, "Death to the tyrant! Death to the madman! Death to Caesar! Death!" That he himself was for the moment the object of enthusiasm of this irresponsible crowd, he could not doubt for an instant. That this same irresponsible enthusiasm was leading the crowd to treachery and rebellion was equally certain. The city guard, egged on by the people, had forced open the heavy iron gates through which Hortensius Martius had passed a while ago, and which led up to the marble steps straight to the imperial tribune. Taurus Antinor, looking up now, saw the Caesar standing pale and trembling, surrounded by his standard bearers, whose attitude seemed strangely irresolute. The Augustas were clinging together in obvious terror. Their heads were pressed close to one another, and the jewels in their hair formed a curious shimmering mass of diamonds and rubies, which caught the rays of the sun and threw back blinding sparks of prismatic colours. Dea Flavia was not near them. She was standing alone up against the dividing wall of the tribune, and leaning back against it, with eyes closed and hands pressed against her heart. All this did Taurus Antinor see, and also that Hortensius Martius, still deathly pale and trembling in every limb, had succeeded in making his way from the arcade where he had found safety, back to the patricians' tribune, amongst his friends. He was standing now in the midst of a compact group, composed of those men who had been present 2 days ago at the banquet in Cassius Nepos' house. They stood close to one another, whispering eagerly amongst themselves. Hortensius Martius was obviously their chief centre of interest, and young Escanes held his hand concealed within the folds of his tunic. And Taurus Antinor no longer paused to think. He had forgotten his lacerated shoulder and his bleeding limbs. Even the horrors of the past quarter of an hour had faded from his mind. All that he saw was that murder and treachery were walking hand in hand, and that the murder of the insane Caesar now would mean the death of thousands of innocent victims later on, that it would mean civil strife and unaccountable misery. And all that he heard was the voice of him who had bidden him to render unto Caesar that which was Caesar's, namely his allegiance, his fealty, his life. The city guard loved him and knew his voice. He had no trouble in inducing the men to let him pass through their ranks and to mount the steps before them which led to the imperial tribune. They let him pass perhaps because they thought that their praefect would wish to take his revenge with his own hands. The gods themselves would have placed a poisoned dagger in the hand of him who had been so ruthlessly exposed to a most horrible death. And as Taurus Antinor's massive figure was seen to mount the steps, the audience broke into cheers. "Hail Taurus Antinor, the god of valour and of strength!" Whilst more ominous than before came that other cry, "Death to the tyrant! Death to the Caesar! Death!" And whilst the city guard followed closely on the footsteps of their praefect, the men amongst the crowd prepared for the inevitable fight which they foresaw. The women and those who were feeble and pacific waved fans and cloaks about and threw dead flowers across the arena, till the whole place seemed like a great pageant of many-coloured flags over which the midday sun had thrown its veil of gold. When Taurus Antinor reached the topmost step, Caligula caught sight of him, and the intensity of his rage was such that his cheeks turned livid and blotchy, and hoarse, inarticulate sounds escaped his panting throat. Even at this same moment the group composed of Escanes and the others seemed to sway in a mass towards the tribune of the Caesar. They appeared to be consulting Hortensius Martius, who had nodded encouragingly. Young Escanes was in the very centre of the group now. His hand was still hidden in the folds of his tunic, and the look in his face told Taurus Antinor all that there was to fear. At his feet, as he stepped into the tribune, lay his own cloak, which he had discarded when first his instinct had prompted him to run to Hortensius's aid. Now he picked it up. It was of dark-coloured stuff, unadorned with the usual insignia of dignity and rank. With it in his hand he ran quickly towards the Cæsar. Caligula saw him coming towards him. His yellow teeth were chattering in his mouth. He stood there palsied with fear, a prey to a deadly feeling of hate and to one of abject terror. Even as Taurus Antinor, with a quick gesture, threw his own cloak round the shoulders of the Cæsar and whispered hurriedly, "Let your praetorian guard escort you quickly to your palace. Gracious lord, your life is in danger from the people and—" "In danger at thy hands, thou infamous traitor," broke in Caligula with a maniacal yell of rage. "Take this, then, in remembrance of the Cæsar whom thou hast betrayed." And quick as lightning the madman drew a short poniard from beneath his robe, and uttering a final snarl of satisfied hate and revenge, he plunged the dagger in Taurus Antinor's breast. Then he snatched the cloak from him, and wrapping it quickly over his head and shoulders, he called wildly to his guard and fled incontinently from the spot. End of chapter 23.
Chapter 24 of Unto Caesar by Baroness Orczy. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please go to LibriVox.org. Recording by Andrea. Chapter 24. The sorrows of death compassed me. Psalm 18 verse 4. Dear Flavia lay upon her bed, with wide open eyes fixed into vacancy above her. Afternoon and evening had gone by since that awful moment when the whole fell purpose of the Cæsar's plan was revealed to her, and she saw Hortensius Martius standing unarmed and doomed in the arena, face to face with a raging wild beast. Afternoon and evening had vanished into the past since she saw Taurus Antinor with Hortensius's body held high over his head, saving one life whilst offering up his own, since she heard that deafening cry of horror uttered by 200,000 throats when the panther sprung upon him unawares and felled him to the ground, whilst his blood reddened the sand of the arena. Afternoon and evening had swooned in the arms of eternity since she saw the terror-stricken Cæsar treacherously stab the man who had rushed forward to save him. After that last agonizing moment she remembered nothing more until she found herself in her own house, lying on her bed, with Licinia's anxious, wrinkled face bending over her. "What hath happened, Licinia?" she asked feebly as soon as consciousness had returned. "We brought thee home safely, my precious treasure," replied the old woman fervently. "All praise be unto the gods who watched over their beloved." "But how did it happen?" queried Dea with some impatience. "Tell me all that happened, Licinia," she reiterated with earnest insistence, as she raised herself on her elbow and fixed her large blue eyes, in which burned a feverish light, upon the face of her slave. "Yes, yes, I'll tell thee all I know," rejoined the woman soothingly. "Thy slaves were close at hand in the vestibule of the imperial tribune, and thy litter was down below with the bearers, in case thou shouldst require it. But I had stood on the threshold of the tribune for some time watching thee, for thy sweet face had been pale as death all morning, and I feared that the heat would be too much for thee. Thus I saw much of what went on. I saw the traitor advance toward the Cæsar, trying to smother him with a cloak. I saw the Cæsar, whom may the gods protect, stab the traitor in the breast, and then leave the amphitheatre hurriedly, followed by a few among his faithful guard. But my thoughts then were only of thee. I could see thy lovely face white as the maple leaf, and thou wast leaning against the wall as if ready to swoon. The traitor whom the Cæsar had justly punished lay bleeding from many wounds close to thy foot. The next moment I had thee in my arms, having caught thee when thy dear body swayed forward and would have fallen even upon the breast of the dead traitor." "The traitor?" murmured dear Flavia then. "Ay, the praefect of Rome," said Licinia with a vicious oath. "He had incited the rabble against the Caesar, and, may his dead body be defiled for the sacrilege, he was causing the populace to acclaim him as the emperor, even whilst he raised his murderous hand against him who is the equal of the gods." "He was striving to save Caesar, Licinia, and not to murder him," said Dea Flavia earnestly. "To save the Caesar? Nay, nay, my precious. The praefect of Rome tried to murder Caesar by smothering him with a cloak. It is false, I tell thee." "False? Nay, dear heart, I saw it all, and thou wast beside thyself and knew not rightly what happened. Even a minute later thou layedst in my arms like a dead white swan, and I pushed my way through the soldiers and past the other Augustas who cowered in the tribune, screaming and wringing their hands. 2 of thy slaves were luckily close at hand. Together we carried thee down to thy litter and bore thee safely home, for which tomorrow I will offer special sacrifice to Minerva, who protected thee." "And what happened after we were gone?" "Alas, I know not. They say that the populace became more and more unruly. There were shouts for the praefect of Rome, who fortunately lay dead on the floor of the tribune, and there were even some sacrilegious miscreants who called for death upon the Caesar." "Do they say," queried Dea Flavia, speaking slowly and low, "that the praefect of Rome is dead?" "If he be not dead now," retorted Licinia viciously, for her loyalty to the Caesar was bound up with her love for Dea Flavia, and treachery to Caesar meant treachery to her beloved. "If he be not dead now, he shall suffer still for his treason, and if he be dead, his body shall be defiled." "Oh, aye, a traitor must suffer even in death. His body shall be given to the dogs, his blood to the carrion." "Silence, Licinia," broke in Dea Flavia sternly. "Fill not mine ears with thy hideous talk. Every word thou dost utter is impiety and sacrilege, and I would smite thee for them had I but the strength. But I am so tired," she added after a slight pause, with a weary little sigh, even whilst Licinia, subdued and frightened, stood silently by. "I would like to sleep." "Then sleep, my goddess," said the old woman. "I'll watch over thee." "No, no, I could not sleep if I were watched," rejoined Dea Flavia with the fretfulness of a tired child. "I would rather be alone." "But thou'lt have bad dreams." "Order Blanca to lie across the threshold. I can then send her to fetch thee, if I have need of thee." "I would rather lie across thy threshold myself," muttered the old woman. "Good Licinia, do as I tell thee," said Dea, now with marked impatience, "and stay," she added as Licinia, still grumbling, prepared reluctantly to obey. "I pray thee, find out for me all that is going on in the city. Mayhap Tertius will know what has happened, or Piso. Go seek them, Licinia, and find out all that there is to know, so that thou canst tell me everything anon when I wake." She lay back on her bed with closed eyes, whilst Licinia kissed her hands and feet, rearranged the embroidered coverlet and the downy cushions, and after a while shuffled out of the room. There was nothing that the old woman loved better than a gossip with Tertius, who was the controller of the Augusta's household, or with Piso, who was the overseer of her slaves, and even her fond desire to watch beside her mistress yielded to the delight of holding long and interesting parley with these worthies. So it was with considerable alacrity that, having deputed the young girl, Blanca, to watch over her mistress, she made her way through the atrium, and thence across the vast peristyle to the quarters of the slaves. Tertius, the controller, had, it appears, sallied forth into the streets, despite the lateness of the hour, in the hope of gleaning some information as to what was going on in the city. Even in the secluded portion of the Palatine, where stood the house of Dea Flavia, under the shelter of the surrounding palaces, weird sounds of human cries and of the clashing of steel was penetrating with ominous persistency. Piso, the overseer, who had remained at home, as he did not feel sufficiently valiant to face once again the disturbance outside, told Licinia all that he had witnessed before he finally found safe haven at home. It seemed that the tumult in the amphitheatre had not ceased with the flight of the emperor, rather that it had grown in intensity when the populace saw the praefect of Rome fall backwards, stabbed by the Caesar, and the latter disappear hurriedly, followed by a few from among the praetorian guard. There was no doubt that the temper of the populace had been overexcited by the cruel scenes of a while ago. Lust of blood and of tyranny had been fanned to a fever pitch through those very spectacles which the Caesar himself had provided for the people, with a view to satisfying his own ferocious desires of hate and of revenge. Now that same fever-heated temper was turning against him, who had fanned it for his own ends. Caligula had made good his escape, satisfied that his dagger had done its work upon the arch-traitor. He had fled through the private entrance of his tribune, and his guard had rallied round him, but a company of legionaries, some 500 or 600 strong, was still in the place, as well as his knights and all his friends, and against these did the wrath of the rabble turn. The lawless and the rough soon had it all their own way, and the peaceable citizen who would have liked to get wife and children safely out of the crowd found it well nigh impossible to make his way through the throng. After a few moments the disturbance became general. There was a great deal of shouting, and presently missiles began to fly about. The rabble attacked the legionaries, and a sanguinary conflict ensued. The former was in overwhelming number, and succeeded in breaking the rank of the soldiers, and in putting them momentarily to rout. After this there was a general stampede down and along the gradients of the amphitheatre, during which hundreds of persons, including women and children, were crushed to death. The scene of confusion seems to have baffled description. Piso, who had succeeded in making his way home in the midst of it all, had even now to wipe his brow, which was streaming with perspiration at the recollection of the horrors which he had witnessed. Whilst he proceeded with his narrative, Tertius had returned with further news, and these of a truth were very alarming. The lower slopes of the Palatine, as well as the Forum and the surrounding streets, were now in the hands of the mob. The few legions who were in the city had been cut off from the Palatine, and though they were making vigorous efforts to break through the close ranks of the crowd, they had, up to this hour, been wholly unsuccessful, owing no doubt to the paucity of their numbers, since the bulk of the army was not yet home from that insensate and mock expedition into Germany. The whole of the troops in and around the city, including the town and praetorian guard, was on this day computed at less than 1,000, and the mob, so Tertius averred, was over 100,000 strong. The law-abiding citizens had locked themselves up in the fastnesses of their homes, and the Cæsar, so it was believed, was inside his palace with a small detachment of his guard around him, 100 strong, who already had had to repel numerous attacks delivered by the more forward amongst the rabble. Tertius had not been able to get far beyond the precincts of the house, for fear had driven him back. The shouts which came from the streets below and from the Forum were ominous and threatening. "Death to the Cæsar! Death to the tyrant!" could be distinctly heard above the din of stampeding feet, and a low and constant murmur that sounded like distant thunder. There was no doubt that the Cæsar's life was in grave danger, seeing that only a handful of men stood between him and the fury of an excited populace, and that these men were without a leader, for the praetorian praefect had been cut off from them, even as he tried to push his way through the crowd earlier in the day. Thus, therefore, did this harbinger of evil news resume the situation. Caligula was in his palace, surrounded by the slaves of his household and guarded by a few soldiers against a raging mob, 100,000 or more strong, who had formed a ring around the Palatine and was clamouring for the Cæsar's death. The legionaries under the command of faithful centurions were cut off from the Palatine and from their Cæsar by the mob whose solid ranks they had hitherto been unable to break. The Augustas and their slaves were also safe within their palaces, but what Tertius did not know, and was therefore unable to impart to his eager listeners, was that the party of conspirators, with Hortensius Martius as their acknowledged leader, were taking advantage of the disturbance to place themselves at the head of the mob, hoping that the cry of death to Caligula would soon be followed by one of "Hail to the Cæsar, the new Cæsar, Hortensius Martius, hail!" End of chapter 24. Chapter 25 of Unto Caesar by Baroness Orczy. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please go to LibriVox.org. Recording by Andrea. Chapter 25. Watchman, what of the night? Isaiah 21 verse 11. And far away beyond the noise and tumult which ranged around the foot of the Palatine, the honey-coloured moon illumined with her weird and ghostly light the vast arena of the gigantic amphitheatre, where a company of the town guard, under the command of an aedile, were busy collecting the dead. A narrow streak of those same ghostly rays found its way through the folds of the curtains which spanned the window of Dea Flavia's room. It peeped in boldly, stirring up myriads of impalpable atoms and whipping them into a living line of silver. It wandered further, and finding a golden head that tossed restlessly upon a silk-covered pillow, it alighted on it, making the white face appear ghostlier still, and the wide eyes to shine like stars. A timid step shuffled across the floor. "Blanca, is it thou?" whispered Dea Flavia. As quickly she raised herself up, squatting now upon the bed, with one hand pressed against the pillow and the other to her breast. "Ay, mistress, it is I," came in whispered response. "Well, have they returned?" "Ay, gracious lady, half an hour ago." "Did they find him?" "Yes." "Is he—" There was a pause, whilst from afar came that strange low sound of thousands of men murmuring, which is so akin to the booming of the waves upon a rocky shore. "The praefect of Rome was in a swoon when they found him in the imperial tribune," said the young slave girl, still speaking under her breath. "Nolus and Dion carried him to the litter, and once or twice he groaned whilst they carried him." A gentle breeze wafted the curtains into the room. The rays of the waning moon fell full upon the huddled figure on the bed, with the stream of gold falling each side of the set, pale face and the large blue eyes now strangely veiled with tears. Where is the praefect now?" asked Dea Flavia. "In the room out of thy studio, gracious mistress, as thou didst direct. Dion did prepare a couch for him in there, and hath laid him down." "And the physician?" "The physician hath seen him. He saith that the praefect is weak with loss of blood. His shoulders, arms and legs have been torn by the panther's claws, but these wounds are not deep. And the dagger thrust." "The physician saith that the dagger must have glanced off the bone. I did not quite understand what he said, and Dion explained it badly." "He did not say that there was poison in the dagger?" "I think not, gracious lady, for the physician said that the praefect would soon be well if he were carefully tended. He is very weak with loss of blood." "Did Nolus and Dion find it difficult to approach the praefect's body?" "They had to parley with the aedile who was in command, and give him all the money which my gracious mistress did entrust to them for that purpose." "After which the aedile made no demur, and asked no questions?" "The aedile took the money, gracious lady, and Dion said that he asked no further questions, but allowed the praefect to be borne away." "That is well," said Dea Flavia, after a brief moment of silence, whilst the girl stood awaiting her further pleasure. "Thou, Blanca, hast served me faithfully, so have Nolus and Dion my slaves. Ye have earned your reward, and though I am grieved to part from good servants like you, yet will I fulfil my promise, even as I have given it to you. From this hour thou, Blanca, art a free woman, and Nolus thy brother, and Dion thy future husband, are free men, and the sum of 600 aurei shall be given unto you tomorrow, 200 unto each. And may you live long and prosper and be happy, for you have served me well." Blanca fell upon her knees and kissed the coverlet on which reposed her mistress. But Dea Flavia did not seem to see her. She was squatting on her heels, with body and head erect, and slowly now, like the rosy kiss of dawn upon the snow-clad hills of Etruria, a faint crimson glow spread over her pale cheeks. Blanca waited irresolute, not liking to leave her mistress before she could be assured that sleep had descended at last on those weary lids. The hour was very late, close upon midnight, and yet the city was not asleep. That constant murmur, like unto the breaking of angry waves, still sent its sinister echo through the still night air, and even in the house of Dea Flavia it seemed that hundreds of eyes were still open, fear having chased sleep away. There was a sound, like the buzzing of bees, that came from the slaves' quarters beyond the peristyle, and from the studio, which lay the other side of the atrium, came the sound of muffled footsteps gliding over the mosaic of the floor. "Go to bed now, child," said Dea Flavia at last. "Thou hast earned thy rest, and stay, tell Dion and Nolus to remain in the studio, and there to spend the night. They must be ready to go to the praefect if he calls. Go." Then, as the girl made ready to obey, the Augusta put out her hand to detain her. "Wait, hast seen Licinia?" "No, gracious lady." "She is not hovering somewhere near my room, or in the atrium?" "No, gracious lady." "And the night watchers?" "They are in the vestibule, gracious lady." "And all my women?" "They are all in bed and asleep." "That is well, thou canst go." Blanca's naked little feet made no sound as she crossed the room and went out by the door which led to the sleeping chamber of the Augusta's women. Dea Flavia waited for a while, straining her ears to catch every sound which came from this portion of her palace. Her sleeping chamber, together with all those on this floor, gave directly on the atrium, which formed a large irregular square in the centre of this portion of the house. The north side of it was taken up with the Augusta's apartments and those of her women, the south side with the reception rooms and with the studio and its attendant vestibules, whilst the main vestibule of the house and the first peristyle gave on either end. From the main vestibule came the subdued hum of voices, and throughout the house there was that feeling of wakefulness so different to the usual placid hush of night. Dea Flavia held her breath whilst she listened attentively. In the vestibule it was the night watchmen who were talking, discussing, no doubt, the many events of the day, and that sound, like the buzzing of bees, showed that the women were awake and gossiping, and that up in the slaves' quarters tongues were still wagging, despite Blanca's assurance and the overseer's sharp discipline. But on the other side of the atrium, where were the reception halls and the studio, everything was still. The young girl threw herself back upon her bed. Sleep refused to visit her this night. The thin streak of silvery moon, which persistently peeped in through the curtain, flicked the tiny atoms in the air until they assumed quaint, minute shapes of their own, like unto crawling panthers and grotesque creatures crowned with a golden halo, and brandishing a mock thunderbolt in one hand and a dagger in the other. Then suddenly all these shapes would vanish, smothered beneath a cloak, and Dea Flavia, still wide awake, would feel drops of moisture at the roots of her hair, and her whole body as if sinking into a black abyss where monsters yelled and wild beasts roared, and huge, black, snake-like creatures tore the flesh off human bones. The hours of the night sped on, borne on the weighted feet of anguish and of horror. Gradually, one by one, the sounds in and about the house died away. The slaves in their quarters must have turned over on their rough pallets and gone to sleep. The women close by had done gossiping. Only from the vestibule came the slow measured tread of the watchman guarding the Augusta's house, and from far away that ceaseless rumbling noise which meant that discontent was awake and astir. Once more Dea Flavia sat up, unable to lie still. Her golden hair was matted against her temples, and in her breast her heart was beating furiously. The waning moon had long since now sunk behind the western clouds. A gentle breeze stirred the curtains with a soft sighing noise, as of some human creature in pain. In the far corner of the room, in a tiny lamp of gold, a tiny wick threw a feeble light around. Dea Flavia put her feet to the ground. The heat in the room was oppressive. No doubt it was that which had caused her restlessness and the dampness of her brow. She shuddered now when her bare feet touched the smooth coldness of the mosaic floor, but she stood up resolutely, and anon crossed over to the door which gave on the atrium. For a few seconds she listened. Everything was still. Then very gently she pushed open the door. On the marble table, in the centre of the atrium, another light glimmered in a jewelled lamp, but the atrium was vast, and the diminutive light did not reach its far corners. The gentle trickle of water along the gutters in the floor made queer, ghost-like sounds, and in the great pots of lilies all round, currents of air sent weird moanings in the night. Dea Flavia, like an ethereal figure clad all in white, and with waves of golden hair shimmering over the whiteness of her gown, glided softly across the atrium. A tiny vestibule led into the studio. She crossed it, guided by her knowledge of the place, for the light in the atrium did not penetrate to this recess. Her bare feet made no noise as she glided along the floor. Her hand pushed the door open without raising a sound. Now she was in the studio, the place in which she did the work that she loved, the place in which day after day she loved to sit and to idle away the hours. In an angle of the room, stretched out upon the bare floor, Dion and Nolus were lying, their even breathing showing that they slept. On the right was another door, which led to an inner chamber, where she oft used to retire for rest from her work. It was a private sanctum, which none dared enter save with special permission from herself. Blanca kept it swept and free from dust, and Licinia tidied it only when she was so allowed. Dea Flavia went across the studio and pushed open the door. It was masked by a curtain, and this too she pulled aside, slowly and nervously, like some small animal that is timid and yet venturesome. She knew every corner of the place, of course, and the very creaking of the hinges and gentle swish of the curtain was a familiar sound to her ear. Nevertheless, she was almost frightened to advance, for the big dark shadow right across the stuccoed wall awed her by its mysterious blackness. It was caused by a large object in the centre of the room, a couch covered with coverlets of soft, white woollen stuffs, on which the night light burning fitfully threw patches of ruddy lights. Dea Flavia had paused on the threshold, with one hand behind her still clinging to the curtain, the other pressed hard on her bosom, trying to still the wild beatings which went on hammering inside her just below her breasts. She thought that she either must be dreaming now, or being awake must have been dreaming before. Once or twice she closed and then reopened her eyes, thinking that perhaps the flickering night light was playing her drowsy senses some elusive trick, for surely Blanca had told her that Dion and Nolus had laid the praefect of Rome on an improvised couch in the chamber beside the studio, and that the praefect was helpless and weak with pain and loss of blood. The improvised couch was certainly in its place, the light of the lamp danced upon pillow and coverlet, but no one was lying there, even though the pillow still bore the impress of the head which had rested upon it. The silence was oppressive, for through the thick walls and heavy curtains of the Augusta's favourite room there penetrated no sound from without, and she herself stood so still by the door, that she was sure the beatings of her heart must be heard through that awful stillness. Suddenly she started, and her fingers closed more convulsively than before on the curtain behind her. Imperceptible as the sound of a swallow on the wing, there came a long-drawn sigh to her ear. Her brow contracted, her eyes narrowed in a great effort to peer past the light into the darkness. On the further side of the couch now, and masked by its shadow, she saw something that was immovable and yet seemed pulsating with life. Gradually, as she peered, that something detached itself from the surrounding gloom. She saw a bowed head, with wealth of tawny hair which gleamed like copper against the white coverlet, two hands white as the pillow beside which they rested, whiter still by contrast with the copper of the hair against them. She saw a pair of broad shoulders, and a powerful body of limbs that lost themselves in the darkness beyond the couch. The face was hidden, and the body was quite still. It would have seemed like that of the dead, but for that long sigh, which, intangible though it was, had broken the silence of the night. Dea Flavia could not now have moved, even if she would. Her small bare feet seemed glued to the cold mosaic of the floor, her hands seemed fastened with clamps of steel to the curtain which it clutched. She had never seen a man thus kneeling alone in the stillness and in the gloom. Why should a man kneel thus, and to whom? Yet she would not have disturbed him, not for all the world. She never dreamed that he would be awake. She had thought of him lying, as Blanca said, exhausted from loss of blood. She had only meant to look on him for a moment, to look into his face as he slept, to try and read in its wonted harsh lines the secrets of his soul. He had rushed to the Cæsar trying to protect him, when thousands on thousands of throats were acclaiming his name as future Lord of Rome. Why? He had rushed into the arena and risked his life to save a man who 2 days ago had insulted him, who, at best, was nothing to him. Why? These questions she had meant to ask him when he was sleeping. Now she could not ask them from that bowed head, nor yet from those clasped hands. And yet, somehow, it seemed that something of the man's soul was revealed to her at that moment, though she could not as yet fathom the meaning of this strange answer to her questions. Her eyes had become quite accustomed to the darkness beyond the light. She could see clearly the powerful figure on bended knees, the wide shoulders with the bandages disposed over them by the physician for the healing of those horrible wounds, and the fingers linked together in a manner which she had never seen before. And now the hands stirred ever so slightly. The light caught the fingers more directly, and Dea Flavia saw that, clasped between them, there was a small wooden cross. And she knew now, all in a moment, that the answer to her questions lay there before her, not in the man's face, for that she could not see, but in his clasped hands and in the cross which they held. She knew that it was because of it, or rather because of that which had gone before, and of which that little cross was the tangible memory, that he had been ready to give his life for an enemy, and to give up all ambition and all pride for the sake of his allegiance to Cæsar. A sigh must have escaped her lips, or merely just the indrawing of her breath. Certain it is that something caused the kneeling man to stir. He raised his head very slowly, and then looked up, straight across the light, to her. For 1 second he remained quite still, on his knees and with that white vision before him, ghost-like and silent, against the crimson background of the curtain. Then softly, as a sigh, one word escaped his lips. "Dea!" He rose to his feet, but already she had fled, noiselessly as she had come, but swiftly across the studio and the atrium and back to her room. But even while she fled it seemed to her that on the silent night air there still trembled the sound of a voice, vibrating with longing and with passion, mournful as a sigh, appealing as the call of a bird to its mate. Dea! End of chapter 25. Chapter 26 of Unto Caesar by Baroness Orczy. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please go to LibriVox.org. Recording by Andrea. Chapter 26. There is no peace, saith the Lord, unto the wicked. Isaiah 48 verse 22. When after a few hours of light and troubled sleep, Dea Flavia woke to partial consciousness, it seemed to her as if Phoebus Apollo had been driving his chariot through a sea of blood. For through the folds of the curtains over the windows she caught a glimpse of the sky, and it was of vivid crimson. The heat was oppressive, and as the young girl tossed with ever increasing restlessness on the pillows, beads of moisture rose on her forehead and matted the fair curls against her temples. She felt too tired to get up, even though she vaguely marvelled how wonderful must be the dawn, since its reflection was of such lurid colour. She lay back drowsy and with nerves tingling. She closed her eyes, for they ached and burned intolerably. Gradually, to her half-aroused consciousness, sounds too began to penetrate. It seemed to her that the usual stately quietude of a house was gravely disturbed this morning. Shuffling footsteps could be heard moving across the atrium. Voices, scarce subdued, were whispering audibly, and the shouts of the overseers echoed from across the peristyle. And through it all a dull monotonous sound, distant as yet and faint, came at long intervals, the sound of Jove's thunder over the Campagna far away. Dea Flavia listened more intently, and one by one through the veil which so kindly sleep had drawn over her memory, the events of the past day and night knocked at the portals of her brain. She remembered everything now, and with this sudden onrush of memory of the past came fuller consciousness of the present. Through the hum of varied noises which filled her own house, she distinguished presently more strange, more ominous sounds that came from afar, like the thunders of Jove, and like them sounded weird and threatening in her ear, hoarse cries and shouts which seemed like peremptory commands, and groans that rose above the muffled din with calls of terror and of pain. In a moment Dea Flavia had put her feet to the ground. She ran to the window, drew back the curtains, and peered into the narrow street which, at this point, separated her house from the rear of the palace of Tiberius. A dull grey light enveloped the city in its mantle of gloom, and it was not the torch of Phoebus which had spread the rosy gleam of dawn over the sky. As Dea Flavia looked, she saw a canopy of dull crimson over her head, and from beyond the palace of Tiberius there rose at intervals heavy banks of purple smoke. Dea Flavia stood there for one moment at the window, paralysed with the dread of what she saw and of what she guessed, and even as a cry of horror died within her throat, Licinia, with grey hair flying loosely round her pale face, and hands held out before her with an agonised gesture of fear, came running into the room. "The miscreant! The miscreant!" she shouted, as she threw herself down onto the floor before her young mistress, and squatted there on her heels, wringing her hands and uttering moans of terror. "They have set fire to the place! They are on us! My beloved, save thyself! Save thyself! O ye gods, protect us all!" This awesome news which Licinia thus blurted out was but a confirmation of what Dea had already feared. Every drop of blood within her seemed to turn to ice. Horror gripped her heart. The oncoming catastrophe appeared suddenly before her, vivid, swift, and inevitable. But she contrived to steady her voice, and to appear outwardly calm as she said: "I do not understand thee, Licinia. Speak more clearly. What is it that hath happened?" "The rabble are invading the Palatine," said Licinia, to the accompaniment of many groans. "They are on us, I tell thee." "On us?" retorted Dea Flavia scornfully. "Tush, woman, they'll not heed us. But the Cæsar, hast news of the Cæsar?" "No, no, my beloved, I have no news. I only know what the watchmen say." "What do they say?" "That the rabble is invading the hill. The miscreants have forced their way into the Forum. They have surrounded the palace of the Cæsar and set fire within its precincts." "Ye gods!" exclaimed Dea Flavia. "Dost hear their shouts? The villains, the villains! Dost hear Jove's thunder, my beloved? His vengeance is nigh. May his curse descend on the villains and on their children." "Silence, woman," commanded the Augusta peremptorily. "Get me a robe, quickly. No, no, not that one," she added, as Licinia with trembling hands had snatched up the gorgeous jewel-studded gown which Dea Flavia had worn the day before. "A dark robe. Haste, I tell thee. Go thou and fetch it, and send Blanca quickly to me." Moaning and trembling, the woman endeavoured to obey, and to make as much speed as her limbs, paralysed with terror, would allow her. She called to Blanca, who together with the Augusta's tirewomen had her quarters close at hand, and the young girl hastened to her mistress's room, whilst Licinia went in search of a dark coloured robe. "The praefect," whispered Dea Flavia quickly, as soon as she felt assured that she was quite alone with her slave. "Hast seen Dion or Nolus?" "My brother spoke to me in the atrium just now, gracious mistress," replied Blanca, who seemed scarce less excited than her mistress. "He and Dion heard a thud in the night, which roused them from a brief sleep which they had snatched, for they were very tired, the long hunt in the amphitheatre." "Yes, yes, go on. I know that they slept, and they heard a thud. What was it?" "They ran to the resting chamber, gracious lady, and found the praefect of Rome lying senseless on the floor." "Great Mother! And what did they do?" "They lifted him as best they could, for the praefect is over tall and mightily powerful, but they succeeded in laying him back on to the couch, and Dion ran to rouse the physician." "And now?" "The physician hath given the praefect a drug to make him sleep, for it seems that fever was upon him with the pain of his wounds, and he talked incoherently like one bereft of reason." "Hush!" interrupted Dea Flavia hurriedly. "Not before Licinia." Even as she spoke the old woman returned, carrying a robe of dove grey cloth, the darkest one that she could find. She had collected the tirewomen round her, and they flocked in her wake like frightened sheep that have been driven into a pen. Licinia herself was evidently the prey of abject terror, for her teeth were chattering, and all the while that she helped her mistress to make a hasty toilet, she uttered low moans as if she were in pain. "The traitors, the miscreants," she murmured at intervals. But Dea Flavia paid no heed to her. Her woman had brought her fresh water, perfumes and fine cloths, and she was hastily bathing her face and hands. Then she slipped on the dull coloured robe, and Licinia's trembling fingers fastened a girdle round her waist. And all the while, from far away, came the dull sound of Jove's thunders hurled by his wrath, and above it all as a constant din, like the roaring of a tempestuous sea, the hoarse cries which, borne upon the wings of the oncoming storm, seemed to gain distinctness as their echo reached this distant house. "Dost hear the cries, Blanca?" asked Dea Flavia, as the young slave, leaning out of the narrow window, tried to peer out into the street. "I hear them, gracious lady," replied the girl in an awed whisper. "And canst distinguish any words?" "Aye, one word, gracious lady. Hark!" And that word sent its dismal echo even to Dea Flavia's ear. "Death!" Then Blanca uttered a terrified scream and quickly drew away from the window. From beyond the palace of Tiberius, there where the new palace of Caligula reared its gigantic marble pillars above the temples below, a huge column of flames had shot upwards to the sky, and a cry, louder than before and more distinct, came clearly from afar. "Death to the Cæsar! Death!" "Ye gods protect him," murmured Dea Flavia fervently. "They'll murder him! They'll murder him!" shouted Licinia at the top of her trembling voice. She had fallen on her knees, and the other women squatted round her like a huddled up mass of terror-stricken humanity, with hair undone and pale quivering lips and staring eyes dilated with fear. But Dea Flavia, now that she was dressed, took no further notice of them. She left them there on the floor, moaning and whimpering, and hurried out into the atrium. Here too the sense of terror filled the air, and the smell of burning wood and of charred stuffs filled her nostrils with their pungent odour. Death to the Caesar! Death! The cry seemed almost at her door. Only the palace of Tiberius, with its great empty halls and basilicas, stood between her and the rallying point of the rebels. She called loudly for Tertius, her controller, and he came running along from the slaves' quarters, with an army of howling men and women at his heels. "What news, Tertius?" she demanded. "Hast heard?" "They have surrounded the Cæsar's palace," said Tertius excitedly, "and demand his presence." "Oh, the sacrilege!" she exclaimed. "And what doth the Cæsar?" "He will not appear, and his guards charge the mob as they advance upwards from the Forum. They have invaded the temple of Castor, and already some are swarming in the vestibules of the palace. The guard are behind the colonnades, and were holding the crowd at bay with fair success until she asked. "Until some of the rebels skirting the palace set fire to the slaves' quarters in the rear. The flames are spreading. The Cæsar will be forced to face the people, and he doth not mean to be buried beneath the crumbling walls of his palace." "The miscreants have set fire to the palace of the Cæsars!" she exclaimed. "Alas!" replied the man, "they will force the Cæsar to show himself to them, and they loudly demand the praefect of Rome." "The praefect of Rome?" "Aye, gracious lady. The people had thought that the Cæsar killed him. Some strove, it seems, to recover his body in the imperial tribune, where he was seen to fall, but the body had disappeared, and the rumour hath gained ground that the Cæsar had it thrown to his dogs." "It's not true!" she cried out involuntarily. "No, gracious lady. Men of sense do know that it is not true, but an infuriated mob hath no sense. It is like an overgrown child, with thousands of irresponsible limbs. It is tossed hither and thither, swayed by the wind of a chance word. But it were as well, mayhap, if it were true." "Silence, Tertius. How canst say such a thing?" "I think of the Cæsar, gracious lady," rejoined the man simply, "and of thee. If the mob found the praefect of Rome now alive or dead, then surely would they murder the Cæsar and make of the praefect their emperor if he lived, their god if he were dead." And, as if to confirm the man's words, the morning breeze wafted through the air the prolonged and insistent cry, "Taurus Antinor, hail!" With a curt word Dea dismissed her controller, and he went, followed by his train of shrieking men and women. She remained a while silent and alone in the atrium, while the moanings of the slaves and Tertius's rough admonitions to them died away in the distance. "If the mob found the praefect of Rome now alive or dead," she murmured, "then surely would they murder the Cæsar and make of the praefect their emperor if he lived, their god if he were dead." Dea Flavia cast a quick glance all round her. The atrium itself was deserted, even though from every side beyond its colonnaded arcade came the sound of many voices, and those persistent cowardly groanings which set the young girl's nerves tingling and caused her heart to sink within her with the presage of impending doom. Only in the vestibule the watchmen sat alert and prepared to guard the Augusta's house. They were gossiping amongst themselves, and seemed the only men in the place who were not wholly panic-stricken. The hum of their voices sounded quite reassuring in the midst of the senseless groans of terror which came from the women's quarters near the Augusta's rooms, as well as from the men in the more remote parts of the house. After that brief moment of hesitation, Dea went resolutely toward the studio. She crossed its small vestibule and pushed open the door. Dion was sitting there on guard, as the Augusta had commanded. He rose when she entered. "The praefect?" she asked hurriedly. "He sleeps," replied the man. "Art sure?" "I peeped in but a few moments ago. His eyes are closed. I think that he sleeps." "I would wish to make sure," she said curtly. Too well trained, or mayhap too indifferent to show surprise at so strange a desire on the part of the great and gracious Augusta, Dion stood aside respectfully to allow her to pass. Then he followed her to the door of the inner room, and held aside the heavy curtain, whilst she put her hand upon the latch. "Dion," she said, turning back to him, "yesterday I gave thee thy freedom, since thou didst serve me well." "Aye, gracious lady," replied the man, as he bent the knee in submissive respect. and I would kiss thy feet for this, thy graciousness. When the city is once more at peace, will before the Quiesta, and thou and Nolus and Blanca shall all be declared free. But to-day thou art still my slave, and must obey me in all things." "As thou dost command, gracious lady." "Then 'tis silence that I do enjoin on thee, Dion," she said earnestly. "Silence as to the praefect's presence in my house, until I bid thee speak, on pain of death, Dion, for thou art still my slave." "I understand, gracious lady." "Then wait for me now, and on peril of thy life allow no one to enter." But scarce had these words crossed her lips than there rose from the atrium behind her a series of weird sounds, cries and imprecations, calls for the Augusta and curses on her slaves, as from one who is bereft of reason and screams in his madness. "The Cæsar," she murmured, as white to the lips now. She stood rigid by the door whilst her hand fell from the latch. "Augusta! Augusta!" came the hoarse cries from the atrium, and the hideous familiar sound of leather thongs whistling through the air reached her straining senses. She put a finger to her lips with a quick peremptory gesture to Dion, then she recrossed the studio with a firm step, and the curtains of the inner door fell back behind her with a swish. The next moment she was standing in the atrium facing Caligula, the Cæsar. End of chapter 25.
Chapter 27 of Unto Caesar. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording done by Jules Harlock of Mississauga, Ontario, Canada. Unto Caesar by Baroness Orczy. Chapter 27. How art thou fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the mornings? Isaiah 14, verse 12. He had a score or so of his guard with him, and they remained at some little distance, in a compact group with their short, bronze-hilted swords naked in their hands. Caligula was livid. He had donned a dark woollen robe, and his head was uncovered. His knees, arms, and hands were shaking, and his mouth opened and closed as if he were gasping for breath. His eyes were bloodshot and staring out of his head like those of a man who is being strangled. "Gracious Cæsar!" exclaimed Dea Flavia as soon as she was before him, and with the instinct born of long usage she bent the knee before him. "They have trapped me," he murmured inarticulately, whilst weird choking sounds escaped his throat. "They have trapped me. Hast heard? Alas! The miscreants, the sacrilegious miscreants, the hideous monsters, the villainous reptiles. Aye, punishment will overtake them, and they shall rue this day. All Rome shall rue this day. Her streets shall flow with blood, and I'll invent such tortures for every man as will turn the firmament red with horror. I'll—" His mouth was twitching convulsively, and his hand clutched spasmodically at his throat. Dea Flavia had risen to her feet. She stood before this raging madman erect and calm, with eyes downcast, for the sight of him filled her with loathing. Suddenly he ceased in his ravings. A loud crash as of crumbling walls had rent the air, followed by shrieks and loud hissing sounds, and that perpetual cry, awesome in its weird monotony: "Death to the Cæsar! Death!" Caligula's face was contorted with terror, his cheeks were grey like those of the dead. He made a quick movement forward and suddenly clutched Dea's wrist. "Dost hear them?" he said in a hoarse whisper, and she nodded in response. "They want to kill me. They want to set fire to my house. I escaped through the crypta, but they were hard on my heels." And as if to confirm his words, the cries of death again rose in the air, the trampling of feet, The angry murmurs became more loud and appeared to be filling the streets close by and trending toward the very door of Dea Flavia's house. "Ah, monsters, miserable monsters!" shouted the Caesar, crazy with fear. "Tomorrow will come the awful reprisals. Tomorrow!" "Today," broke the Dea Flavia coldly. "The Cæsar is in danger of his life." "They'll kill me," he cried, whilst once more trembling, akin to palsy, seized his limbs. "They'll kill me, Augusta. Hide me ere they come." And he fell on his knees, grovelling on the floor like a fawning beast, with quivering hands clutching the young girl's robe, his forehead beating the ground at her feet. "Hide me, Augusta," he murmured through his groans. "Hide me. Do not let them kill me." She drew back in horror and disgust, closing her eyes lest she should see his degradation of the Cæsarship, this breaking down of her highest ideals. But 2 days ago this same abject creature had stood beside her, demanding from her obedience and loyalty which she was fully prepared to accord to him. He had called on her fealty in the very name of that Cæsarship which she worshipped and which he was now degrading and lowering to the dust. Then as now Jove's thunders from the afar had proclaimed the wrath of the gods, then as now Jove thundered his warnings to that man not to defile the majesty of the Cæsars. But 2 days ago she had still believed in and acknowledged that majesty. She had bent her will, curbed her inclination, smothered her every girlish inspiration, her every womanly instinct to the dictates of that power which came straight from the hands of the gods. Now she felt actual physical nausea at the sight of this pitiable coward, who, wallowing in his own cruelty, had not even the unreasoning pluck of a brute defending its life. Involuntarily her thoughts flew back to the man who was lying helpless in her house. She saw him in her mind as she had seen him yesterday, bounding in the arena to save another's life, strong and determined, measuring and accepting every risk, looking neither to right nor left, whilst he carried his self-imposed burden to safety, and then falling without a groan, felled to the ground by the claws of the panther. And outside the cries had become quite distinct. "Death to the Cæsar! Hail Taurus Antenor! Hail!" The people, in their fury and their exultation, had condemned one man and exalted another. Truly the gods themselves had guided them in their choice, and now it seemed as if the final choice rested with her, as if in some distant shrine mysterious oracles had spoken and told her that the future of Rome lay in her hands. And involuntarily she looked down on her hands and saw that they were tiny and weak, and yet one of them would within the next few seconds point the way to destiny, show her whither she should go, carrying on her giant shoulders the whole empire of the world. At her feet a cowardly and inhuman creature grovelled, abjectly praying for a life which by its continuance could only bring more sorrow, more horrors, and more misery to thousands upon thousands of human beings dependent upon this half-crazy monster. Behind her, behind 2 walls, there lay a man amongst men, from whom the people clamoured, whose very presence betokened strength, and whose every glance diffused peace. A man born to rule a people and to guide the destinies of an empire, and whose life of simple integrity had yesterday been crowned by an act of sublime sacrifice. And the choice rested with her. Her ears were buzzing with the hoarse cries from without, the cry of death mingling with that of hail, the name of Cæsar blended with that of the praefect of Rome. and through it all, drowning them by their hideous sounds, the groans and the shrieks of a bloodthirsty tyrant, brought down to the dust by his own cruelties, and even now thirsting for more. The choice did rest with her. She had but to run a few steps to the vestibule, and there to call loudly to the populace that even now was invading the slope of the hill towards her house. She had but to rush to her door, and to shout boldly, "The Cæsar is here, and the praefect of Rome is nigh," and the 20 men who were waiting with naked swords would be as naught before the onslaught of the people. She looked round her helpless and dazed, whilst the fawning creature on the ground embraced her ankles and kissed her feet, and repeated with frantic persistence, "Save me, Augusta, save me. Do not let them kill me. I have been good to thee. I am thy guardian, thy Cæsar. Save me." "Save thee?" she repeated mechanically. "How can I?" "Hide me somewhere where they cannot find me," he murmured, half raising himself from the ground. "Thou wouldst not give up thy Cæsar to the fury of the populace? Thou wouldst not soil thy hands with the blood of thy kinsman?" Now he was embracing her knees, and his hideous, distorted face was looking up appealingly at her. "Thou wouldst not soil thy hands with the blood of thy kinsman?" Even as these words escaped his flaccid lips, a roll of thunder louder than any previous one came echoing from behind the Aventine hill. Dea Flavia shuddered. Was it Jove's warning, or already Jove's curse, the curse of the gods on her for the treachery of her thoughts? "Thou wouldst not soil thy hands with the blood of thy kinsman?" he repeated pitiably. "No, no," she said hurriedly, "not that. I'll help thee. What can I do?" "Let me hide in thy house." "Where?" He pointed to the studio. "There," he said. "No, no," she exclaimed, and instinctively her arms were held out as if she would protect a sacred shrine. "Thy workroom is private," he urged in tones of abject entreaty. "No one would venture there. Only thy women slaves ever cross its threshold. It should be quite safe in the inner room. Thy women would not betray me. Thou hast some that are mute. They could attend on me there, and no one would know of my presence until this outrage hath subsided. In a few hours mayhap the Praetorian Guard will succeed in forcing a passage through the raging mob. My legions too are on their way from Germany. They will be here soon. They were only 4 days' march behind me and my convoy. They are but a couple of days' march now from the city gates. I could stay in there, in thy private room, with a few men to protect me, and thy women to attend on me. No one else would know." He talked volubly, at times incoherently, with hoarse voice and quaking lips. She tried with all her might to free herself from his convulsive clutch, but he clung to her like a dying man would cling to the last breath of life, like a drowning man would cling to the raft on which he might find safety. "In there," he entreated. "No, no. I should be safe and nobody would know." And now he raised himself to his feet, and swaying like a drunken man, he turned towards the studio, calling to his guard to follow him. But she was still between him and that door, between this raving, bloodthirsty maniac and a helpless man who was lying wounded and in a drugged sleep on a bed of sickness. The oracle had not yet finished speaking. The last word still hung in the air. Her choice had not yet been made. But at this moment, when Caligula and his guard turned towards the studio door, she knew that it would not be long in the making. Never should that demented tyrant cross the threshold of her studio and wreak his hatred and revenge upon the fallen hero. Rather than that should happen, she would call to the people and hand over the Caesar, her kinsman, to an infuriated mob. Better that than to deliver a wounded man into the claws of a raging brute. Then mayhap the blood of her kinsman would stain her hands forever. Then, too, no doubt would come horror, remorse, and malediction of the gods. Then so be it. That would she take upon herself. What must be suffered, that she would suffer. The torments of remorse would be infinitesimal compared with the awful sacrilege which the Caesar's hand would perpetrate, were he allowed access to the praefect of Rome. And even as the resolve became firmly implanted in her heart, she found herself murmuring softly words which she had heard in the Forum a few days ago. "I have but one soul, and that is in the hand of God." Something of the serenity which had then shone from the man's face now entered into her heart. Horror and excitement fell away from her like a useless mantle. She felt herself absolutely calm and unswerving in her determination. Therefore she did not make a rush for the studio door. She did not with dramatic gesture interpose her body between it and the Caesar. She merely put her hand out and let it rest upon his arm. "I should be safe in there, and nobody would know," he murmured. "My slaves would know," she said coldly, "and would betray thee." "I only fear the men, and they need not know," he said eagerly, even though at her words he had paused and turned back towards her. "Many of them have seen and heard thee. Tell them I have escaped to the palace of Augustus, through the crypta. They would not believe it. They would know it was not true. Canst thou not trust thy slaves?" he snarled. "Couldst thou trust thine?" she retorted. "I can change robes with one of my guards," he urged, "and he could then pretend to be the Caesar escaping through the crypta to the house of Augustus." "'Twere safest not to make pretence," she rejoined coolly. "Rather let the Caesar do what he suggests." "What is that?" "The palace of Augustus would be the safest stronghold for the Caesar until the arrival of the legions. It would be safer than the house of his servant, for prying eyes may have seen him enter it, and ears, sharpened by hate, may have heard his cries." "Then I am lost," he exclaimed. "Not if my gracious lord will take counsel of his servant. The underground way is clear and safe. The palace of Augustus will afford ample shelter. 20 men well armed will watch over the Caesar, and the house of Dea Flavia will furnish the necessary food." Caligula hesitated a moment. His shifty eyes wandered restlessly over the face of the young girl. "Thou'lt not betray me," he murmured. "I could betray thee now, and I would," she said simply. "The mob is at my gate. One call from me and the Caesar is in the hands of those who desire his death." "Hush, hush," he said, once more clutching her wrist and gazing fearfully around him. "Speak not of this, Dea. The very words might call down the decree of the gods. I'll trust thee," he added, bringing his livid face close to her own and speaking with a fever of maddened fury. "But if thou shouldst fail me—" "No need of threats, great Cæsar," she said, calmly disengaging her wrist from his grasp and stepping back from him. "If I failed thee to day, neither I nor thou would be alive on the morrow." The truth of what she said must have struck his dulled mind, for the look of savage ferocity quickly died from his face, leaving it once more pale with abject fear. He must have realised that his own unreasoning cowardice had placed him entirely in this girl's hands, and that having feared to meet his people a few hours ago, he had cut off from beneath his own feet the bulwark of dignity and of unapproachable sanctity on which he should have stood. "I'll to the house of Augustus," he said more quietly, "while the rabble vent their rage upon my palace and search for their Cæsar, that they might murder him. I'll remain there in peace. Do thou send thy most trusted slave into the streets, and let him endeavour to reach the praetorian guard who are holding their ground behind the crowd of rebels. They might effect a flank movement, which, if unexpected, might put the miscreants to rout sooner than we anticipate. Hast a slave whom thou canst trust thus far?" "I have 2 freedmen," she replied, "freed since yesternight, who would give their life for me." "Let them do it then," he retorted cynically, "and do thou lead the way to the triclinium. I am hungered, and a halt at thy table would throw dust in the eyes of thy slaves. I can reach the crypta from there without being seen again." "As the Cæsar commands," she said calmly, "but there is little time to be lost." Chapter 27